Okay, showtime. Well, old folks, thanks for tuning in. I hope you enjoyed the White Elephant's Gold. Um, Today we're going to start the second book. Actually, it's the first book that I wrote, but the reason I didn't put it up first on this channel is because it's a little dark. Some of the people that read it, they enjoyed it, or they said they enjoyed it, but it was a little too dark for a lot of people. I don't know. I had, what was it that one guy that read it called me a sick puppy, I think it was. I don't know. I really didn't think it was that dark, but I basically grew up reading Stephen King, so what can I say? But anyhow, it deals with a bad subject to a lot of people, but if you'll give it a chance, I think you'll enjoy it, because most people, they get through the first couple of chapters and they're thinking they're not going to like it, but then later on, after it evolves a little bit, they realize it was a good thing. So anyhow, now, being this was the first book I wrote, I went a little overboard, which I tend to do with almost everything that I do in life. And I did a few little things that I basically just need to explain, and I'll do that, in before every episode, so that you can. It's a little easier if I explain it ahead of time. And there were some things I wanted to do that I just flat give up on after while I was writing the book, because I would have an idea, and I would basically test the idea on some friends and some people that I knew, and when I get back nothing but blank stares, okay, we won't do that. But I thought it would have been pretty neat. But one of the things I did do to a degree was, since I grew up playing the original video games, I put an Easter egg in the book, and I originally was going to just give you a few clues, and you would have to actually then go and take those clues and basically go on the internet and look up the rest of the facts, or the rest of the knowledge that the clues led you to, and then that would kind of give you an extra little level to the book. But I finally just kind of gave up and pretty much give you the answers to it in the book. I didn't make them totally obvious, but I'll try to give you little hints as we go along. But if you ever, like I say, if you ever have a question, and on this book you may have a few questions, and if you do, don't hesitate to put them in the comments, and I'll answer them. But make sure you want the answer before the end of the book, because you might spoil some things later on. So anyhow, now this book, the timeline on this book is of a lot of years. It's a long timeline that's in the book. The book's not that long, but the timeline spans a lot of years. And what I thought I would do at the very first chapter, and if you're reading the book, it's a little easier to keep up with than if you're listening. So I'm gonna kind of give you a little clue in every now and then. But if there's a dramatic date change, then the date is listed at the beginning of the chapter, so you kind of realize what's going on. And the first chapter is kind of a flash forward to almost the time frame that the end of the book is in. So the very first little chapter is just a flash forward, and it kind of I guess it could pique your interest. I don't know. I've never done it again in any of my other books because all it seemed to do was cause confusion. But anyhow, the first little chapter is a flash forward to a specific date, and it's listed at the very first front of the chapter. But then chapter 2 comes back to the present, and then basically the book works its way up from the present to the date that was in the very first chapter. So if that seems confusing, which obviously it did to a lot of folks, I watched every episode of Lost 5 times, so flash forwards, flashbacks, flash sideways, I don't have a problem with them. But anyhow, let's get started. And the first episode is chapters 1 and 2. They don't need much explaining besides the first chapter being a flash forward. So, hope you enjoy.
The Terminal Revolution. Written by W.R. Bottoms. Narrated by W.R. Bottoms. Chapter 1. March 8th, year 2207. Franklin Moorhead sat at his office desk enjoying his morning coffee. Looking out the window of his corner office, he could see the street below. Small electric cars and shuttles zipped up and down the street, and occasionally a hover car flew by. Suddenly, Don Green, the head of research, burst into his office. Don was very excited and a little out of breath. Franklin looked at Don for a few seconds, then asked, "Did you find him?" "Yes," Don replied. Chapter 2. June 20th, year 2008. Richard Davis, rich to his friends, sat at his kitchen table trying to enjoy his morning coffee. But his mind was already on his job that he hated. Rich had been a carpenter for most of his life. He had not set out to be a carpenter. When he was young, he just kind of fell into it, and it appeared he had a natural ability. Rich had done other things through the years, but always seemed to come back to carpentry. For a while it looked like Rich had it made. Through hard work and a lot of planning, he had single-handedly built a new house paid for in part by his wife Susan's winnings at the local casino. The couple had been happily married for 30 years now, and although they never had had any children, it really didn't seem to bother either of them. They could come and go as they pleased, with little to worry about. They owned everything they had, including their home, land, 3 cars, 2 motorcycles, and any other toys that they might want within reason. This was all part of what Rich liked to call the grand plan. The last part of the plan was to be able to get an easy, no-stress job. This part was working until recently. When Rich finished his house, he got a job at a small local cabinet shop. At first it was ideal. His supervisor was an old-school carpenter just like him, and they got along great. There was no stress, and the money was okay. This lasted for about 6 months. One morning Rich got to work and was told the supervisor had been fired. He inquired to the reason, and was told some long drawn-out story that he could easily see was a lie. A temporary supervisor was brought in, and things started going downhill from there. Eventually a permanent supervisor was hired. He turned out to be a young kid that didn't have a clue how to run a business, but he did have his nose very far up the owner's butt, and that seemed to be enough. Rich started looking for other jobs and applied for some, but at the time the unemployment rate was over 9%, and he was having no luck. So every morning he would drag himself to work with only one thought in mind: is it 5 o'clock yet? This morning Rich was drinking his coffee, and he noticed a small pain in his stomach. Too much coffee and stress, he thought, as he took an antacid pill and didn't give it a second thought. The next morning the pain was back, so he took another antacid pill. After 3 months he was up to 6 pills a day, and the pain was a lot worse. After much haggling, Susan finally convinced Rich to see a doctor. Rich didn't like doctors or hospitals, but the pains weren't getting any better. After a good going over by their family doctor, she recommended Rich check into the hospital for a list of tests. "That's not going to happen," Rich said immediately. "You decide which of these tests are the most important, and I'll get them done as an outpatient." Okay, the doctor agreed. She could tell that was all she was going to get. Over the next 2 weeks, Rich was prodded, poked, and stuck with needles, and none of this did anything for the pain. Finally, in the 3rd week, Dr. Sully called Rich and set up an appointment for him to see her. Rich could tell the moment he stepped into Dr. Sully's office that the news was bad, just by the look on her face. Rich sat down and said, "Give it to me straight, Doc. Don't sugarcoat it." "I'm very sorry to say you have stomach cancer, Rich, and it's spreading rapidly to your liver and kidneys." "Sounds about right," Rich said without blinking. "Is there any treatment?" "Yes, but it involves a lot of surgery, and the success rate is about 5%. "How long do I have?" "About 6 months." "I'm very sorry to tell you this, Rich. This is the worst part of my job. It makes me feel bad all over." "Thanks, Doc, but you would be human if you didn't feel bad." "Can I start the preparations for your treatment?" "Let me talk to my wife, and I'll get back in touch with you." Rich thanks her again, then leaves the office. Rich gets in his truck and lights a cigarette, a million thoughts running through his mind. The most prominent of these is how is he going to tell Susan? After 3 cigarettes, he decides, well, I'm not dying today, so I might as well get to work. Rich arrived at the cabinet shop a little after 10. It was a mid-sized shop that employed about 10 people. The owner was never around, if you could call him an owner. His father had started the business and expanded to 4 shops in the surrounding towns. He had gotten old and turned them over to his 3 sons, who were currently running them into the ground after the California housing bubble had burst. All they knew were good times and had no clue how to operate in lean times. But the old man's savings hadn't run out yet, so they were still going. Rich walked to his workstation and started working. Within 5 minutes, the supervisor walked up. He was not in a good mood. The time Rich had been using to have all the tests done was cutting into his production schedule. "Well, what did they say this time?" he asked Rich in a patronizing tone. "The doc says I have cancer in about 6 months," Rich said straight up. "Oh, damn, that means I'll have to get an ad in the paper for your position soon. Do you know how expensive those ads are?" the supervisor replies. Rich had a hard time believing what he was hearing. This guy's a natural born asshole. Rich glanced at his workbench. There was a wood chisel lying there. For just a moment he imagines taking the chisel and ramming it through the supervisor's neck. What snaps him back to reality is the realization that while he was daydreaming about killing the supervisor, the pain in his stomach had totally gone away. It was just now starting to creep back in. Rich looked up from the bench. "Do you think I could leave a little early today?" he asked. "Oh, I don't know," the supervisor replied. "We're getting behind, and the owner's not here for me to ask. If you could stick it out, it would be better if you finished the day." With this said, he turned and walked away. Rich was not at all surprised by this last reply. He just shook his head a little. One of the employees, David, a good friend of Rich's, walked up. "Can you believe that guy?" "I wasn't eavesdropping, but I heard everything. I'm so sorry, Rich. Is there anything I can do?" "Yes," Rich replied. "Telling people seems to be the hardest part. Could you let everyone here know?" "I sure can," David replied. As Rich was driving home that night, he decided he needed a drink. In fact, he felt he deserved one. He stopped at a small bar on the outskirts of town. There were no cars in the parking lot, but the little neon open sign was on. He went in, sat down, and ordered a beer. The bartender had a name tag that read Bobby, and he seemed like a nice enough fellow. Rich took a drink and looked around the bar. He was in fact the only customer, as the parking lot had indicated. Rich was on his 3rd beer and a little woozy when another man came in. Otherwise, he would have thought it peculiar that he had not heard a car pull up. The man walked straight to the jukebox, put some money in, and selected N17 without looking at any of the choices. Rich knew the song that started playing, just some old classic rock. The man walked over and sat down next to Rich. "The usual, Bobby," he said. "Yes, sir, Mr. B," Bobby replied. Rich glanced at the man and noticed with some amazement that he was wearing what must have been a $3,000 suit. It was solid black and almost glistened. "Can I get you another?" the man in black asked Rich. Sure, Rich replied. Bobby brought the drinks, then seemed to busy himself at the other end of the bar. The man in black turned to Rich and asked, "So, how was your day, Chief?" Here we go, thought Rich. But he was just drunk enough not to care. "Today my doctor told me I have 6 months to live," Rich replied. "I see," replied the man in black. What an odd response, Rich thought. After a few minutes of silence, the man in black turns to Rich and says, "You know, some people find news like that empowering." "What are you talking about?" Rich asked, a little agitated. "Well, some people start doing real dangerous things for thrills. Others spend all their money and run up their credit cards. But some just curl up in a ball and die. Which are you, Rich?" Rich was just drunk enough not to realize that he had not introduced himself to the man. "Well, there is one more option. You could spend your remaining time doing good for mankind," the man in black said, eyeing Rich suspiciously. "Yeah, right," Rich replied, somewhat slurred. "I don't mean you have to win a Nobel Peace Prize. Just do something that makes life a little bit easier for the people around you," said the man in black. "Okay, I have to go," the man in black said as he tossed a $100 bill in Bobby's direction. "Keep the change, Bobby." "Give it some thought, Rich." He turned and left. Again there was no sound of a car. Rich went home and told Susan the news. She had expected as much, but always hoped for the best. But she wasn't stupid and knew the odds. "What are we going to do?" she asked Rich. "I don't know yet," he said. After that she started to cry, and was still crying when she fell asleep in his arms later that night. The next day Rich went to work as usual. About 10 o'clock he went to the vending machines to get a Coke. On his way he caught the supervisor really chewing out one of his co-workers. Later Rich asked the co-worker about it. "All I did was make a slight mistake on some paperwork," the co-worker answered. "There was no harm done, and it didn't cost the company any money. I just think he likes chewing people out," the co-worker added. Rich thought back to yesterday and the wood chisel, and again the pain eased up a bit. This time Rich wasn't as shocked, and his brain made the connection. "Okay," Rich thought, "let's try this." This time Rich imagined the whole thing from start to finish in slow motion. It lasted about 3 minutes. By the time he was through, the pain had completely vanished, but now it was very slowly creeping back. "The people around you," the man in black had said. He slowly looked around at his co-workers, most of them good friends, and a plan began to form in his head. Rich could almost do his job blindfolded, so the rest of the day he concentrated on the plan. He also found he could keep the pain in check by visualizing the wood chisel every now and again. Rich decided he needed to talk to the man in black again. He stopped at the bar on his way home. He asked the barkeep if he would be in again. Bobby said probably not. He only comes in every few months, and the only way he remembered him was because he tipped so good. During the next week, Rich discovered he no longer needed the pain pills the doctor had given him. When he stopped taking them, his mind became as clear and sharp as it used to be. By Friday, he had finished the plan. Rich went home and told Susan the plan. "If it makes you feel good, then that's the plan," she said, and that was that. Rich spent the weekend in his computer room. He was pretty good with computers, and one of his hobbies was to modify pictures, so it was no real chore for him to make a fake driver's license. He took this and got one of those prepaid credit cards online. He then opened a PayPal account and also got room on a major server for his own website, called terminalin.com. The only thing he put on the website was a construction sign that read, "Coming soon, stay tuned." He then linked his page to other cancer sites and self-help sites for terminal people. These other sites thought Rich's site was going to be another feel-good, goody-two-shoes site, so they had no problem putting a link to his site on theirs. Rich knew they would only check once and not look again unless someone complained. After a week, he put a guest book and a counter on the site. All the guest book required was that you leave your email address so you could be contacted when the site was finished. The county fair was the next week, and the gun laws in his state were pretty lax. Rich went down and looked until he found just what he wanted, a .22 250 hunting rifle. The vendor looked at the fake license. But when Rich slid a $100 bill across the counter, the vendor just smiled and said, "Will that be all, sir?" "No," Rich said, "I need a silencer." "Those are illegal," the vendor remarked, notably alarmed. "But I can sell you a suppressor." They work almost as well," his smile returning. "That would be great," Rich said as he slipped another 100 across the counter. Rich then went to the local pawn shop and purchased a laptop with a Wi-Fi card and a scope and an ammo for the rifle. The next day he attached the scope and sighted it in at a local gun range. So far so good, he thought. It took several nights to get the laptop programmed, but everything he wanted was on the internet. All you had to do was look long enough. The next few days after work, Rich drove about half a block away and watched the supervisor's habits. The shop closed at 6. All the other businesses in the area closed at 5. So the area was pretty deserted. The supervisor did the same thing every night. He was the last one to leave the building. He locked the rear door and walked to his car, which was parked in the same spot every day. The next day, Rich was in the same spot, but this time his finger was touching a trigger. Rich had never wondered if he could really do it when the time came. The thought had simply not crossed his mind. Rich had never been in any of the armed services because the draft was over before he was old enough. Had he joined and been given a psych profile test, he would have learned that he would have no problem killing something that needed killing. Rich looked at his watch, 5 after 6. He looked around. No one was in sight. He put his eye back to the scope. The supervisor came out the back door. Rich waited until he turned the key in the lock, then pulled the trigger. The suppressor worked great, just a little noise and almost no recoil. So Rich was able to keep his eye to the scope and watch as most of the supervisor's brain hit the locked back door. "That'll do," Rich said to himself. Then methodically put the gun in its case and put the case behind the seat. Rich then drove to a local truck stop that offered Wi-Fi. Here he hacked into their service with his laptop and sent an email. The next morning he arrived at work at the usual time. The place was teeming with cops and detectives. They had the back entrance taped off with that yellow police tape, so he went around to the front. He was stopped at the front door by a policeman who demanded to know who he was and why was he here. "I work here," Rich said. The policeman turned to another officer and said, "We got another employee." The second officer walked up to Rich and ordered him to follow him. He was led to the employee lounge. Rich's co-workers were already there, most looking confused and scared. "What happened?" Rich asked. David spoke up. "The supervisor was killed last night. They think it was a robber because the money bag was gone." Suddenly the owner came into the room. "The police have a few questions for everyone." He was going to continue when his cell phone rang. He answered it, listened intently for a few minutes, then said, "When did you get that?" After that he hung up and rushed out of the room. The owner went to his office and closed the door. The police had already looked it over and seemed to be concentrating on the rear of the building at the moment. He fired up his computer and opened his email account. He scrolled down through the usual junk and found one marked "Careful." He opened it. The email simply read, "Your supervisor was killed because he was a greedy asshole. Change your ways or suffer the same fate. Show this email to the police and suffer the same fate." The message was not signed and had no address. He read it twice, then without hesitation deleted it. He then got out his cell phone and called his brother back. "Did you delete it?" his brother asked. "Yes." "I called the other stores and they deleted theirs. What do you think we should do?" "I think we better change our ways unless the cops catch the killer," the owner replied. "Good thing you called when you did. I was about to tell my guys they could get back to work as soon as the cops left. Think I will give them the day off with pay now." "I think we should close all the stores since we are all connected," his brother added. "Good idea." The detective called the employees into the inner office one at a time. Some stayed longer than others. Finally it was Rich's turn. He walked in and sat across from a young detective that introduced himself as Rick something. Rich wasn't good with last names. Rick asked the standard questions, like how long have you worked here, how long have you lived here, and such. Then he stepped forward a little and asked, "What did you think of the supervisor?" Rich didn't hesitate. "I wouldn't piss on him if he was on fire." The detective didn't seem too surprised at that answer. "Where were you last night?" he asked. Rich replied, "I went home after work." "And then?" "Watched TV." "What did you watch?" "Started with the factor," Rich stated. "What did you think about the memo?" "I found his take on the flat tax interesting." What did you watch next? Nothing. I fell asleep until my wife got home from bowling about 9:30. Rich had in fact recorded the factor and watched it twice just for this very reason. Okay, Rich, that will be all. Thanks for your cooperation. As Rich left the office, David came running up. The owner says we can take the day off with pay. Sounds like the Christian thing to do, Rich replied. The next morning, the owner called them all to a meeting first thing. There was coffee and donuts and fresh fruit. He started by saying the funeral was in 2 days, and of course that would be a day off with pay. He went on to say that he was going to take a more active role in running things until another supervisor was hired, and that he was looking into getting them health insurance and some kind of retirement fund going. Rich looked up from his donut. Most of the mouths in the room were hanging open. Rich said, "Sounds good, boss," then went back to his donut. The next few months were great. A new supervisor that cared more for his employees than the company was hired, and everyone was happy. The owner was going over the quarterly numbers. "This can't be right," he muttered to himself as he checked and rechecked. He soon realized the numbers were right. Total profit was up 40%. Quality was up, and that had boosted sales through the roof. Sick time was almost non-existent, and the new health and retirement plan were acting as a great tax write-off. "Well, I'll be," he said to himself as he picked up the phone and punched his intercom button. "Attention, everyone. Take the rest of the day off." Rich found he liked going to work again. Then the pain started coming back, and no matter what he did, it would not subside. His body was starting to shut down. He ended up in a hospital bed, hooked up to a morphine IV drip. He controlled the amount by pressing a button on a remote, but he could tell that soon that would not be enough. The doctors wanted to hook him up to all kinds of machines. Rich would have none of it. This morning the doctor said it looked like about a week to go. It's going to be a long week, Rich thought. That night, after everyone went home, including Susan, Rich said it was stupid to sleep in the chair by his bed when she had a good bed at home. He promised he wouldn't die until she returned in the morning. A dark figure walked past the nurse's station. They seemed not to notice. It opened Rich's door. Rich squinted through the morphine haze to see who had come in so late. The dark figure crossed the room. To Rich it looked like the Grim Reaper. So much for the 1-week prediction. The figure reached out and touched Rich's arm. This is it, Rich thought. Then something strange happened. The pain completely vanished, and the morphine haze was gone. Rich could see that the dark figure was really the man in black he had met at the bar that night. "What the hell? Am I dead or alive?" Rich asked. "You're still alive," the man in black replied. "Did you cure me?" Rich asked cautiously. "No, I just took away the pain and cleared your mind." "Why didn't you cure me?" "It's not in the cards, and besides, dying is not as bad as everyone thinks," the man in black replied. "Why did you take the pain away?" "Think of it as a reward. But you need to finish what you started," the man in black said. He then turned and left the room. Rich just stared at the door for a while. He then set the morphine remote on the nightstand. Won't need that anymore, he thought. He then turned over and went to sleep. He slept the whole night, something he hadn't done in a long time. The next morning he awoke when the nurse came in to take his vitals. When she was done, Rich asked, "Could I get you to bring me a wheelchair?" The nurse looked at him in astonishment. "We can't allow you to leave the bed, sir," she said with an air of authority. Rich just shook his head and picked up his cell phone. "You people forget too easily just who is paying the bill. I am, and that makes me the customer. Now, I have my lawyer and the newspaper on speed dial. Shall I get them down here to witness you refusing to get a dying man a wheelchair?" You could see the fear on her face. "No, sir, I'll get you one immediately." And with that she ran out of the room. In less than 2 minutes she was back with a wheelchair. "Just leave it over there, and thank you," Rich said. He then flipped his cell phone open and called Susan. "I need you to bring a few things with you today, dear." Susan arrived around 10. Rich sat up on the edge of the bed and started pulling the IV from his arm. "I don't think you should do that," Susan said. Rich looked at her and grinned. What's the worst that could happen? With a little help from Susan, Rich made it to the wheelchair. "Hand me my cell," he said. As he passed the nurse's station, The head nurse for that shift opened her mouth as if to protest. Before she could get a word out, Rich held up his cell and flipped it open. That stopped her in her tracks. Glad to see news travels fast in here, Rich thought. They went outside and over to a small park next to the hospital. It might have been part of the same property because there was a sidewalk connecting the two. They stopped at a small bench under a large shade tree. Rich asked, "You get everything?" "I think so." "Smokes first." Susan handed him a pack of cigarettes. He lit one and took a long drag. "Coffee?" She produced a thermos and poured him a cup of steaming coffee. "Irish cream?" "It's in there," she said. Rich had given up coffee and cigarettes on his doctor's orders when all this first started. In the end, it hadn't helped at all, and he was determined to enjoy his last few days. He looked at the warning label on the pack of cigarettes. It went on and on about the risk of lung cancer. Rich chuckled to himself because his lungs were one of the few places he didn't have cancer. After a couple of smokes and a couple of cups of coffee, he asked for his laptop. "Are you sure you want to do this?" Susan asked. "Yes, I don't have much time left, and if they figure it out, what are they going to do to me? Put me in prison for 2 days? She handed Rich his laptop that until this morning was hidden in the storage unit rented with the fake credit card. There had been only 2 things in the unit, the laptop and a case containing the rifle. Now the rifle was in the unit of a trusted friend. Rich fired up the laptop. He was still in range of the hospital's Wi-Fi. He knew they would discover his hack, but he only needed a few minutes. He logged into his website and clicked the upload button. This self-executing program changed the whole website. It spelled out in clarity everything Rich had done and why, explained how to do everything down to the fake driver's license, and provided a small compacted file for free download if you wanted to take the whole plan with you. It also immediately took all the email addresses that had been collecting in the guest book and notified them that the site was now up and running. The file also activated a very nasty virus that had been lying dormant until now. Rich left the laptop on to watch the visitor counter on the bottom of the page. It was getting close to noon and the hospital tech guy might be at lunch. For a little while nothing happened. Then the counter clicked a few times. By the time they went back inside, it was at about 100 visits per hour. When the hospital tech guy got back from lunch, he checked his system status, and everything appeared to be okay. So he went about his business. The next morning, before Susan got there, Rich had a surprise visitor. It was Rick, the young detective that had interviewed him. Rick sat down next to the bed. "What brings you by, Detective?" "I just wanted to see if you had anything to add to your statement." "No, nothing I can think of." "How long do you have?" "A couple of days." "I'm sorry. My father died of cancer." "Are you a good man, Detective?" The detective looked a little surprised at this. He thought for a minute, then said just one word. "Yes." That was the exact answer Rich was looking for. Not a little, or maybe, or any other half-assed answer. Just plain yes. "Okay," Rich said. He wrote something on a notepad that he had beside the bed, folded it in half, and gave it to Rick. "Do me a favor," Rich asked. "Don't look at this until you get back at your desk." "Okay," Rick said, and tucked the note in his pocket. Rick got up to leave. "See you later," he said. "Probably not," Rich replied. Susan arrived soon after, and they had coffee and smokes under the shade tree again. That afternoon, Rick sat at his desk looking at the note. It simply read, terminaln.com. What the hell, he thought, and typed in the address. The page took forever to load. Must be on the slow server, Rick thought. When it finally loaded, Rick was utterly mystified. After reading it over a few times, he got up to get the paperwork started on an arrest warrant. He took 2 steps from his desk and froze. An image had flashed into his mind. One of his father, slowly dying as Rick stood by, totally helpless. It was the worst feeling he had ever experienced. He realized he had broken out in a cold sweat. He turned back to his desk and clicked the home button on his web browser, crumpled the note up, and tossed it in the wastebasket. "I'm not going down that road," he said to himself. Out in the hallway of the police station, a man dressed in black had been sitting on one of the benches drinking a cup of coffee. He now got up, put the paper cup in the waste bin, and left the building. Rich died 3 days after the detective's visit. He simply didn't wake up from a nap that afternoon. Susan had been by his side reading. She knew exactly when it happened. She had felt a cool breeze brush her cheek, and it had caused her to look up from her book, and she could tell he was gone. She called in the nurse, and she confirmed it. "I don't see how he made it these last few days without the morphine," the nurse told Susan. "You know, that's the one thing he wouldn't tell me," Susan said. Rich had not told Susan about the man in black because he really didn't know for sure what his deal was. He was always a little vague. Rich really didn't know if there was a soul up for grabs in any of this, so he decided to keep Susan out of that part of the plan. Susan took a small detour home that night. She drove around a small lake. At the end was a bridge that went over the corner of the lake. When she got about halfway across the bridge, a square silver object sailed from the window and into the lake. When she got home, she turned on the television just for the noise. She saw that the country had elected a new president. She hoped this one was better than the last two.